I don't even know where to start. I guess I'll just say it. The day my life was completely flipped upside down, I didn't see it coming. Emily and I, we had a really great marriage, or at least I thought we did. We were happy, or so I thought. It felt like one of those relationships that other people look at and think, wow, they've got it figured out. We'd been together for 7 years, married for 5, no major problems, no real fights. We had our routine, our little jokes, even our arguments here and there. But nothing serious, nothing that ever made me feel like there was any real risk to us. She was always so affectionate, so loving. I never once questioned her loyalty or commitment. Maybe that's the mistake I made, putting her on a pedestal. But she was the person I trusted most in the world. When I came home from work, there she was, always with a smile, always making me feel at home. We were that couple that took vacations together, laughed at dumb shows on Netflix, spent hours talking about nothing and everything. She was my best friend, my confidant. Then, one day, everything started to shift. At first, it was subtle. Little things I couldn't quite put my finger on. She seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else, but I thought maybe she was just stressed at work or going through something privately. Emily always had a lot on her plate. Work, managing the house, keeping up with friends. But it was only after a few weeks of this distant behavior that she finally sat me down and told me something I never in a million years would have expected. She started by saying she needed to confess something, that she'd been feeling guilty, like she was hiding something from me. Naturally, I thought she was going to admit to something like overspending on clothes or maybe an argument with a friend. But no. It was something far worse. She said she'd been unfaithful. And not just once. This affair had been going on for months. And the worst part? She claimed she didn't even remember doing it. I was speechless. It hit me like a freight train. I couldn't even look at her at first. I asked her if she was serious, if she was just trying to hurt me or get me to feel sorry for her. But she was adamant. She swore she wasn't lying. She told me that she had dissociative amnesia, that whenever things got emotionally intense, she would switch off and lose awareness of what she was doing. She claimed she didn't even realize what was happening during the affair. I tried to process that. I wanted to believe her, even though deep down, it didn't make any sense. How could someone not know what they were doing? How could they just forget something so important? But the thing was, Emily was so convincing. She looked at me with those wide, desperate eyes, tears streaming down her face. She was apologizing, explaining how terrible she felt, how much she hated herself. She even went as far as to say that she never wanted this to happen, that she had no memory of it, that she had no control over it. I didn't know what to think. Part of me was furious. The other part was so confused that I didn't know if I was coming or going. But I didn't want to make any snap decisions. I mean, maybe she was telling the truth, right? We'd been married for years. Was this something I could even understand? Could I really just walk away from her like that without giving her a chance to explain? So, I told myself I'd stick by her. I was going to support her. We would figure it out. But as the days went on, things got stranger. More and more inconsistencies started popping up. I kept thinking back to the little details she mentioned, things that just didn't add up. The way she talked about the affair, it didn't sound like someone who didn't remember. It sounded like someone who was trying to cover her tracks. But I couldn't bring myself to confront her just yet. I wanted to believe her. I kept telling myself that maybe this was just some weird condition. Maybe she really had lost control. Little did I know, I was in for a wake-up call that would shatter everything I thought I knew about Emily, and about myself. The more I thought about it, the more things didn't make sense. The whole dissociative amnesia excuse. It was like she was reading from some self-help book on trauma. She even tried to convince me that it was something she'd been dealing with for years, and that it was just now becoming apparent. But the more she explained, the more I started to question everything. I mean, how do you not remember cheating on your spouse? How do you switch off when you're kissing someone, when you're being intimate? That didn't sound like an illness, that sounded like a cop-out. But I kept telling myself I was being harsh. People with mental health issues do experience things like memory gaps or emotional detachment. Maybe there was something to it that I didn't understand. I wasn't a psychologist, after all. Emily said she'd seen a therapist about it, but when I asked for more details, she dodged the subject. She was careful about what she said. If I pushed too hard, she would cry and apologize again. She'd tell me how much she regretted it, how much she loved me, and in those moments, I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the more she said, the more my gut told me that something was off. Her stories kept changing. The timeline didn't add up. She'd say one thing one day, and then the next, it was like she was telling a completely different version of events. One moment she'd say she had no memory of the affair, the next, she'd remember little details, like how guilty she felt after each time it happened, but not enough to stop it. Or how she'd keep telling herself that it wasn't her fault because she couldn't control it. But wasn't that exactly what someone would say if they were trying to cover up their tracks? I started to question things outside of her words too. The small, random inconsistencies started piling up. She'd mentioned something about Daniel, her colleague who she was supposedly having this affair with, and I'd catch the tone in her voice. There was something in the way she'd talk about him that didn't sound like someone describing a random, meaningless fling. It sounded like she had a connection with him, a deeper one than just a mistake. But every time I tried to ask her more, every time I asked about him directly, she'd turn the conversation around. She'd talk about how I was the one she loved, how I was the one who meant everything to her, not him. And after enough tears, I'd back off, because I didn't want to make her feel worse. I didn't want to push her to the point where she'd spiral and break down even more. I just didn't know what to do. But the more I tried to let it go, the more these feelings of doubt crept in. It felt like I was being manipulated. It wasn't like her to be so evasive. I mean, we'd always been able to talk about anything before this. But now, every conversation felt like a minefield. Anything I said could either make her cry or make her angry. And each time I tried to get closer to the truth, I'd find myself tangled in her web of excuses and guilt. It wasn't long before I started to wonder if maybe I wasn't just being paranoid. Maybe I was letting my emotions cloud my judgment. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe this was some psychological condition, and she really wasn't responsible for what she did. But there was still this nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like I was missing something. Something important. I tried to keep my head straight. Really, I did. I even looked up some stuff online about dissociative amnesia, read a few articles, watched a couple of videos. There's a part of me that wanted to believe her, to think that maybe she really was suffering from something. But the more I dug into it, the more I realized how rare this kind of thing is. Most people who experience dissociative amnesia don't have the capacity to act out entire lives while in a fugue state. It's not something that just happens with emotional intimacy. That doesn't make sense. Still, I wanted to be there for her, and I didn't want to make any rash decisions. Maybe this was a cry for help, I thought. Maybe she was just too ashamed to admit what she'd really done. So I tried to keep an open mind. I tried to show her support, despite all the questions bouncing around in my head. But it became harder and harder. It wasn't just the emotional distance that was getting to me anymore. It was the little things, the things I'd never noticed before, but now seemed so glaringly obvious. Her phone became off-limits, even more than usual. She'd get defensive if I asked to see it, or if I asked about messages, even though we'd always had an open policy with our phones. She'd start to make excuses about why she couldn't answer calls right away, or why her messages took longer to reply to. And when I tried to press her about Daniel again, about what exactly had been going on between them, she'd either change the subject or say something like, "I don't know, I can't remember." It started to feel like she was lying to my face. Then came the night that everything shifted. I was at home alone, Emily had stayed late at work, and I decided to go through some old emails. I wasn't proud of it, but I was desperate for answers. The more she kept dodging, the more I felt like I needed to take control of the situation. I didn't expect to find what I did. There, buried in one of her old email folders, was an audio file. I almost didn't click it, but something told me to listen. It wasn't long, just a couple of minutes, but what I heard hit me like a punch to the gut. It was Emily, talking to Daniel. And not just talking, laughing, flirting. The tone of her voice. It was so different from the way she ever spoke to me. It was the voice of someone who knew what they were doing, someone who wasn't switching off during emotional intimacy. She was fully aware of what was happening. And then, she said it. Something that sent a chill through my whole body. She admitted to the affair. She talked about how she'd been lying to me, how she'd convinced me that it was all her condition. But really, it was just easier to get away with it that way. She mentioned how much guilt she felt for dragging me through all of this, but she kept saying how she couldn't stop. And she was so casual about it. So calculating. She talked about how I didn't deserve this, how she never wanted to hurt me, but that she couldn't just tell me the truth. How she couldn't face me, because she didn't want to lose me. But then she followed it with, I know I'll be fine. I'm sure Mark will just move on and forgive me like always. He always does. It felt like the ground fell out from beneath me. I couldn't breathe. I had to pause it, had to let it sink in. It was like everything I thought I knew about Emily, the person I thought I married, was a lie. She'd been lying for months. And not just about the affair, but about her entire justification for it. The dissociative amnesia, the memory lapses, the emotional detachment. It was all a story she'd fabricated to manipulate me into believing she was the victim. She wasn't confused. She wasn't struggling with some disorder. She was just using me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my phone through the wall, to call her right then and there and tell her I knew everything. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there shaking, numb. All this time, I had been trying to understand her, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. And all along, she had been playing me like a fool. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just sit there and pretend like I didn't know what I now knew. So, I waited for Emily to come home that night. The house felt empty, quieter than usual, but my mind was a whirlwind. All I could hear was her voice in that recording, and every word she'd said cut deeper than any betrayal ever could. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I had to say something. When she finally walked through the door, everything felt different. The way she smiled, the way she tried to kiss me like nothing was wrong. It just hit me all at once. This wasn't my wife anymore. This was someone who had completely destroyed everything we'd built together. She must have noticed something in my face, because right away, she asked me what was wrong. I didn't answer. I just stood there, looking at her. And then, I pulled out my phone. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't need to. I just played the audio. The same damn recording she thought she could hide from me. The second the conversation started playing, Emily froze. Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I watched her eyes dart around, like she was searching for some way to deny it, some way to twist it back into a story that made sense, but she couldn't. She knew I knew. She finally spoke, her voice trembling. She tried to tell me it wasn't what it sounded like, that I didn't understand the context. She said she was just venting to Daniel, that it wasn't real, that it didn't mean anything. But I wasn't buying it. I wasn't the fool anymore. I looked at her. You lied to me, Emily. You lied to my face for months. You manipulated me. You used me. And for what? To cover up your affair with Daniel? My voice shook with rage, but I couldn't stop myself. You told me you didn't remember anything. You made me think it was some kind of mental condition. And now I hear this? You're not sorry. You're just sorry you got caught. She tried to apologize again. She said she'd never meant for it to go this far. That she didn't know how things had gotten out of hand, but I could see right through her. She didn't sound sorry for me. She sounded sorry for herself, like she was trying to avoid the consequences of her actions. She begged me to understand, to help her fix this, but all I felt was anger and disgust. I couldn't believe I had let her manipulate me for so long. I told her, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. This marriage is over. It felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but it was also the hardest thing I'd ever done. Telling someone you love that you're leaving them, especially when you've built so much together, is never easy. But I had to do it. I couldn't live in the same house with someone who didn't respect me enough to be honest. I couldn't look at her and pretend that everything was fine when I knew she'd been betraying me the whole time. I don't think she expected me to be that firm. She begged me to reconsider, told me she was getting help for her condition. But I didn't buy it anymore. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with therapy or promises of change. She had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. I told her that I would be filing for divorce the next day. She could pack her things and leave. And then I walked out. I went to a friend's place for the night. Just needed some space, some time away from the chaos. I was numb, to be honest. My heart was broken, but a part of me also felt this overwhelming sense of relief. The truth was out. The weight was gone. But it was still hard. I mean, how do you just erase 7 years? How do you let go of someone who was supposed to be your person, your partner? But then again, she wasn't my partner anymore. She hadn't been for a long time. The days after I confronted Emily were like a blur. The house felt cold, empty, and strangely quiet. I stayed at a friend's place for the first few nights, just trying to keep my head together. I needed space. Space to think, to breathe, to wrap my mind around the fact that everything I'd believed in for the last 7 years was a lie. Every corner of that house had memories attached to it. Memories I couldn't look at the same way anymore. Emily tried to contact me over and over again. Texts, calls, voicemails. Every time, I ignored her. I was done talking. She didn't deserve the opportunity to manipulate me again. She tried to apologize, but the things she was saying didn't even sound real. The guilt, the remorse she suddenly claimed to feel, none of it was convincing anymore. How could I trust anything she said? She'd already lied about something as huge as an affair, and that wasn't something you could just sweep under the rug with a couple of tearful apologies. Finally, a few days later, I moved forward with filing for divorce. I wasn't sure what would happen next, how long it would take, what I'd have to go through, but I knew there was no turning back. I couldn't stay married to someone who had deceived me so completely. The weight of the betrayal had crushed whatever feelings I had left for her. But even though I was resolute in my decision, things still didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped. Emily didn't just accept it. She fought it. She tried to guilt-trip me, telling me that I was being unfair, that she was trying to change, and that I was the one who was abandoning us. She even claimed that I was being cruel, by not even letting her have a conversation about what had happened. But no matter how hard she pushed, no matter how many times she asked for another chance, I kept thinking back to the recording, the proof that she'd been playing me for months. There was no negotiating with that kind of betrayal. Then came the hardest part, telling our friends and family. I won't lie, part of me wanted to just keep the whole thing quiet. I didn't want to deal with people's pity, or the awkwardness that would come with explaining everything. But I couldn't stand the idea of Emily spinning some kind of narrative where she was the victim, where she could play off her lies and have everyone feel sorry for her. I needed to make it clear what had really happened. I didn't want to drag anyone into our mess, but I couldn't let her get away with this. So I told the people who needed to know, our closest friends, my parents, a few of her family members. And the fallout was bigger than I expected. People were shocked. Some were angry at her, some were sympathetic, but all of them were concerned about how I was holding up. Honestly, I was numb for a while. I didn't want anyone's sympathy. I just wanted to move forward. Emily, of course, tried to control the narrative. She started telling people that I was being unreasonable and that I was overreacting. She even tried to convince a few of our mutual friends that she had no idea how it happened, that she was broken and couldn't control her actions. But the more she spoke, the more people started to see through her. The cracks in her story were getting wider, and her reputation, both personally and professionally, began to unravel. It didn't take long for the truth to spread. People at her work started hearing about the affair. A few co-workers reached out to me privately, saying they were shocked, but that they'd suspected something for a while. Her career took a hit, her personal relationships with friends became strained, and the walls started closing in on her. I didn't want this for her. But she made her choices, and I wasn't going to be the one to protect her anymore. As for me, the divorce process dragged on. There were lawyers, there were arguments, there were back and forths about who would get what. Emily tried to pull the poor me act with our lawyer, but it didn't work. I had all the evidence I needed, and I wasn't backing down. There were days when it felt impossible. I'd lie awake at night, feeling like the rug had been pulled out from under me. I'd remember the happy moments, the laughs we shared, the trips we took, and it felt like everything was tainted. She was never the person I thought she was. She was a stranger now, a stranger who had betrayed my trust in ways I didn't even know were possible. But through it all, something started to change in me. I was angry, yes. I was heartbroken, definitely. But there was a quiet strength that began to emerge. For the first time in years, I was taking control of my own life. I wasn't letting her manipulate me anymore. I wasn't letting the guilt she was trying to put on me affect my decisions. I started seeing a therapist. Not for her, not to fix things with Emily, but for me. I needed to heal. I needed to find myself again. I was doing it for my own peace of mind, because I realized that I couldn't keep living in the shadow of her lies. Therapy helped me process the pain and anger, helped me realize that I was worth more than the way she treated me. Slowly, I started rebuilding. Slowly, I started finding joy again in things I had forgotten I loved. I made new memories, without her in them. And Emily? Well, she was left alone. Alone with the mess she'd made. Alone with the wreckage of the life she thought she could destroy without consequences. I don't wish her pain, but I don't feel sorry for her either. Because she chose this. And in the end, I chose me. The months after the divorce were a strange mix of loneliness and liberation. On one hand, I had this newfound freedom that came with not having to answer to anyone, not having to explain myself or second-guess everything I said. I was no longer walking on eggshells, wondering if I was triggering some emotional breakdown or fighting off a wave of defensiveness from Emily. There was no more pretending to be in a relationship that had become a lie. I had my space, my time, and slowly but surely, I was starting to find me again. But even though I was free, it didn't always feel that way. There were nights when the silence in my apartment was deafening, and I'd catch myself thinking about what could have been. Could we have worked through it? Could I have been a better husband? I went through that self-doubt phase, even though deep down, I knew I didn't deserve any of what had happened. Still, healing takes time, and I knew I couldn't rush it. So I kept going to therapy, kept trying to piece myself back together. The therapist was patient with me, helping me untangle the mess of emotions Emily's betrayal had left in its wake. We worked through my anger, my sadness, and the guilt I had for ever trusting her so completely. The biggest thing I had to come to terms with was that her affair wasn't my fault. I hadn't done anything wrong. She chose to betray me. She made those decisions. One of the hardest things was dealing with the friends we had in common. Some of them were supportive. A few even told me they'd suspected something was off with Emily for a while. But others took her side. I don't think they meant to hurt me, but some of them were quick to defend her. They said she was going through something, that she'd been struggling, and that I should be more understanding of her mental health issues. It was like they didn't even see what she'd done to me. It stung, honestly, to have people who knew both of us turn a blind eye to the pain I was going through, just because they liked Emily more or didn't want to deal with the reality of the situation. But in the end, it became clear that I didn't need people like that in my life. They weren't true friends. They were just people who had their own agendas and weren't willing to see the truth. So I distanced myself from them, and it wasn't easy. There were a few awkward conversations, a few strained attempts to reconnect, but I just wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. One of the good things that came out of all of this was that I got closer to my family. I realized how much I had been neglecting my relationship with my parents, my siblings. I'd gotten so caught up in my marriage, in trying to make things work with Emily, that I had pushed them to the sidelines. But they were there for me when I needed them most, and that meant more than anything. I even took up some new hobbies, things I'd put off for years. I started running again. I went to concerts with friends. I traveled solo to a few places I'd always wanted to see. It felt good to remind myself that I was still me, that I wasn't just the guy who'd been cheated on, or the guy who was stuck in a failed marriage. I was Mark, and I still had a lot of life ahead of me, but the hardest part was seeing Emily from a distance. We hadn't spoken directly since the divorce. She tried a couple of times to reach out, to apologize again, but I blocked her number. I didn't want to get sucked back into her drama. The last time I saw her was at a mutual friend's wedding. I could tell people were avoiding her. She looked different. She looked like someone who had lost everything, like someone who couldn't keep up the facade anymore. It was almost hard to watch, but then I remembered what she'd done. I remembered the lies, the betrayal. She was no longer the woman I had loved. She was someone I didn't recognize, someone who had destroyed everything for the sake of her own selfish desires. And in that moment, I realized that I had no reason to feel sorry for her. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. And as for me, I was moving on, slowly but surely. I wasn't in a rush, but I knew that I was getting stronger every day, even when it didn't feel like it. I had a lot of healing left to do, but I was getting there. I was finally learning to love myself again, without needing anyone else's validation. That was something I'd never thought I'd say after everything that happened. But the truth is, I'm better off without her. And as much as it hurts to admit, it's taken me this long to realize, I'm enough. It's been almost a year since the divorce was finalized. A year of ups and downs, breakthroughs and setbacks. And yet, looking back, I can honestly say I've come farther than I ever thought I would. For a long time, I thought I was going to be stuck in the past, constantly reliving the betrayal, wondering how everything went so wrong. But now, I see things more clearly. One of the biggest things I've come to realize is that I didn't just lose Emily. I lost a version of myself. The guy who was so wrapped up in trying to make her happy that he forgot about his own happiness. The guy who tolerated lies because he was scared of being alone or admitting he wasn't in control of his own life. I used to think that love meant always forgiving, always sacrificing, always accepting the bad parts because I loved her. But I've learned that's not love. That's self-doubt masquerading as commitment. The funny thing is, I've started dating again. And I'll admit, it was tough at first. Not because I was desperate to jump into a new relationship. God knows I needed time to heal, but because I had to unlearn some of the patterns I had with Emily. I had to relearn what it meant to trust someone, to be open without the fear of them betraying me. There's this woman Sarah, I met at a mutual friend's barbecue a few months ago. She's funny, smart, and has this way of making me laugh when I really need it. She doesn't remind me of Emily, which I'm thankful for. And she's got this easygoing way about her, no drama, no baggage, no need to prove herself or play mind games. We've gone out a few times now, and every time I think about the future, it feels like something real is possible. I'm not rushing anything. Again, no pressure. I'm learning to take things slow, not trying to force something that isn't there, but for the first time in a while, I feel like I'm allowed to want more. And then there's the whole part about forgiving myself. It's still a work in progress, but I've gotten to a point where I understand that I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't cause this mess. It wasn't my fault that Emily made choices that ultimately shattered everything. I don't have to keep asking myself what if. What if I had seen the signs earlier? What if I had done things differently? What if I had demanded more honesty from the start? It's easy to fall into those traps, to think that there was something I could have done to avoid this pain, but I've realized something important. I did the best I could with the information I had at the time. I gave everything I could to our marriage. I loved her, I trusted her, and I fought for us. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, someone else's choices are out of your control. One of the most painful things was the way Emily completely rewrote the narrative to make herself the victim. After the divorce, she started telling people that I was the one who gave up on the relationship, that I was cold and unforgiving. It didn't surprise me that she was still trying to manipulate the story, but it hurt. It made me realize how much she was still playing the game, even after everything she'd done. I tried not to let it get to me, but honestly, I was pissed. She had lied, she had betrayed me, and she was still trying to make me the bad guy. I eventually stopped responding to any of her messages, stopped trying to clear up the confusion. I realized that if people believed her version of events, that was their problem, not mine. I couldn't waste any more energy on defending myself to people who weren't interested in the truth anyway. As time passed, I got more comfortable with being alone. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was defined by someone else's actions. I didn't have to live up to Emily's expectations, or her version of who I should be. I was starting to figure out who I was again, without all that noise. And it felt good. I'm proud of how far I've come. I'm proud of the person I'm becoming, the one who isn't afraid to be vulnerable but is also strong enough to protect his own heart. I'm proud that I didn't let the lies she told destroy me. In a way, I think I've found peace with everything. I'll never forget what she did, but I've learned not to carry that burden. The anger has mostly faded. The resentment is still there, but it's manageable now. I've forgiven her, not for her sake, but for mine. Because I need to move on, and holding on to that anger would just hold me back. So, here I am, looking forward, not backward. And for the first time in a long time, I can honestly say that I'm excited for what's next. I'm not broken. I'm not defeated. I'm just starting over. It's funny how life works. Just when I thought I had everything figured out, when I thought I was finally in a place where I could put the past behind me, life threw me a curveball. A couple of months ago, I ran into Emily at a coffee shop. I wasn't expecting it, and honestly, I wasn't sure how I'd react if I ever saw her again. I'd built up this new version of my life, one where I was in control, where I didn't let her shadow hang over me anymore. But there she was, sitting by the window, looking exactly like I remembered her. Except there was something different about her. Something that wasn't so polished. She looked tired, worn down even, and when our eyes met, I could see it in her face. This was not the confident woman who had once made me believe I wasn't enough. I froze for a second. I didn't know if I should approach her, if I should just walk away. But then, she stood up and came toward me, almost like she wanted to say something. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to approach me after everything that had happened. I don't know what I expected, but it definitely wasn't the look of someone who'd lost everything. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders slumped. She wasn't the same person who had been so full of herself after the divorce, so convinced that she could still control the situation. This Emily was different. She was vulnerable. And for a moment, part of me felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything she had done to me. And just like that, the empathy I felt faded, and I remembered exactly why I had cut her out of my life. She started talking. Apologizing again. This time, it seemed more real, more raw. She said she had been seeing a therapist for months, working through her own issues, her fears, and her mistakes. She admitted that she had used her condition as an excuse, that she'd lied about everything, that she was too selfish to see the damage she had caused. She said she was sorry, and part of me wanted to believe her. I really did, because I'm not a cold person. I wanted to believe she was capable of change. But I knew better. I listened. I didn't interrupt, I didn't yell, and I didn't try to make her feel worse than she already did. I just let her talk. I let her say all the things she thought would make it right. But as she spoke, I realized something. It was too late. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even disappointed, honestly. I was just indifferent. The person I was before, the one who would have fought for her, tried to make it work, tried to forgive and forget. It was like he wasn't even in the room anymore. That person didn't exist anymore. When she finished, I stood there for a second, taking in everything she'd said. And I looked at her, not with hate, not with anger, but with something I hadn't felt in a long time: closure. I don't know what you want from me, Emily, I said. But the truth is, I've moved on. I've worked through all this. I'm not angry with you anymore, but I'm also not going to be a part of your life. I can't be. Not after everything that's happened. She nodded, looking like she'd expected it, but still, there was a look of disappointment on her face. She apologized again and told me she understood. She even said she hoped one day we could be friends again, but I knew that wasn't going to happen. There was no room for us in each other's lives anymore. We exchanged a brief, awkward hug, and then she left. That was the last time I saw her. And honestly, it didn't even feel like a victory. It didn't feel like some grand moment of triumph. It was just the end of something that had been broken for a long time. But as much as it was an ending, it was also a new beginning for me. I don't have the same emotional baggage I had before. I'm not carrying the weight of a failed marriage around anymore. I'm free from the manipulation, the lies, and the hurt. I've finally let it go. And in doing so, I've allowed myself to grow. A lot has changed in the past year. I'm in a better place now. Mentally, emotionally, even physically. I've started taking care of myself in ways I never did before. I've made more time for friends, for family, for myself. I don't feel guilty about being happy anymore. And while I'm not sure where life is taking me, whether it's with Sarah or on my own, I'm okay with that. I'm learning that the future doesn't have to be mapped out to be meaningful. I don't need someone to complete me. I've learned that I am whole, just as I am. So yeah, I guess that's my story. From the lowest point of my life to where I am now. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I thought I wasn't going to make it out, but here I am. Stronger, wiser, and finally at peace with everything that happened. To anyone reading this who's been through something similar, I just want to say, it does get better. Maybe not immediately, maybe not as quickly as you'd like, but it does. You'll heal, and you'll find your way again. And one day, you'll wake up and realize that you're better off than you ever thought possible. Take it one day at a time. You're stronger than you know. It's funny, but the more time passes, the more I realize that life really doesn't give you clear answers or easy paths. You think you're healing, that you're getting to the point where everything feels normal again, and then something happens. Something small, something you didn't expect, that reminds you that life is still, well, unpredictable. A few weeks after running into Emily, I got a call from my lawyer. It was about the last bit of paperwork we had to wrap up for the divorce settlement. There were a couple of loose ends with property division and some financial stuff we hadn't quite agreed on. It was the last formality, really. I thought that once it was done, I'd be free of the whole mess. But, as you might expect by now, things didn't go that smoothly. I got a text from Emily a few days later. One of those long, drawn-out messages. She wasn't just apologizing this time. She was asking me to reconsider everything we'd agreed on during the divorce. She wanted more than just a financial adjustment. She was basically asking me to help her get back on her feet, emotionally and financially. She claimed she was in a really dark place and needed my support. I couldn't believe it. Here she was, months after the divorce, asking me to come back into her life in some way, whether it was as a friend, as a lifeline, or just as someone who would help clean up the mess she'd made. I almost didn't respond, but something inside me snapped. I didn't feel angry this time, but I did feel frustrated. I went back and forth about whether I should even address it, but in the end, I felt like I owed myself the closure. So, I wrote back, short, direct, no emotional baggage. I told her that I had already given her everything I could, that I had been there for her through thick and thin, and that the relationship we had was over. I told her I'd worked hard to get where I was, and that I couldn't let her drag me back into her world of manipulation. And you know what? She actually responded, with something almost as manipulative as the original affair. She said that if I truly cared about her, I would help her. That I was being cruel by cutting her off like this. That it wasn't about the money or the property. It was about being there for her during her hardest times. But this time, it didn't shake me. Not like it would have before. I didn't fall for it. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't get sucked into her game. I guess it took me that last moment to fully realize just how much control I still had over my own life. She could apologize, she could cry, she could try to play the victim again, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I wasn't going to let her rewrite my story. So, I blocked her number. Again. And this time, it felt final. It's strange, but that small moment, the moment I stood my ground without hesitation, felt like a turning point. I wasn't the guy who was defined by the breakup anymore. I wasn't the one who had to keep dealing with her emotional mess. For the first time in a while, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, my feet firmly planted in the present, not the past. This journey has been filled with surprises. I've had days where I doubted myself, where I wondered if I was making the right choices. I've had moments where I felt the loneliness creep back in. But with every challenge, I've learned more about who I am, what I want, and what I'm willing to accept in my life. It's not perfect. I still have moments of doubt. There are times when I think about what could have been with Emily, about the dreams we shared, the life we planned. But then I remember the reality of what she did. I remember how much she hurt me, how much she lied to me, how easily she manipulated me. And that's when the doubt fades away. Now, I can't even imagine going back to that life. The life where I was constantly second-guessing everything. The life where I thought my worth was tied to someone else's validation. I've learned that healing isn't a straight line. It's full of ups and downs, of unexpected turns and moments where you think you're back to square one. But eventually, the pieces start to fall into place. I'm still figuring things out, figuring out what I want in a relationship, figuring out how to be happy on my own, figuring out how to trust again, but I'm not rushing it. I've got time. I'm no longer trying to fit into some ideal of what life should look like. I'm just taking it one day at a time. And as much as I've changed, as much as I've learned, I know one thing for sure. I'm never going to let someone make me feel less than I am ever again. I'm not waiting for someone to fix me. I'm not looking for someone to complete me. I'm whole on my own. And whatever happens next, I'm ready for it. I've been meaning to write this for a while now, but I kept putting it off, not because I didn't want to share it, but because I didn't think I was quite ready to put everything into words. It's strange how life works, though. You think you're done with something, that you've healed and moved on, and then, bam, something unexpected happens, and suddenly, you feel like your whole world has shifted in the best possible way. A few weeks ago, I got some incredible news. I got the promotion I've been working toward for the past 2 years. It's not just a raise, it's a whole new level of responsibility, a chance to step into a leadership role I've been eyeing for a while. I've always been someone who takes pride in my work, but after the divorce, after everything that happened, I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel motivated in the same way again. I'd gotten to a point where work was just something to get through, a way to keep my mind occupied and pay the bills. But this was different. This felt like my achievement, something I earned on my own. When I found out, I didn't feel that immediate rush of adrenaline I thought I would. There wasn't a big celebration or anything. I just sat there, processing it for a second, and then it hit me. I was actually happy. Not the "I'm relieved this is over" kind of happy. Not the "I've survived this crisis" kind of happy. But real, genuine happiness. The kind that comes from being proud of yourself and knowing that you've earned what's coming to you. It took me a while to even grasp how significant that was. For so long, I'd been focused on trying to fix things, on trying to rebuild the life Emily had helped tear down, on trying to feel whole again. And then, out of nowhere, I realized that I'd already done it. Not by pretending the past didn't happen, not by going back to old patterns, but by moving forward, without her. By doing the hard work of healing, of growing, and finally getting to a place where I could look at myself in the mirror and say, I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of how far I've come. But the promotion wasn't even the biggest blessing. No, the real unexpected gift was the way it made me realize how much I genuinely had to be thankful for. I've been spending more time with people who actually care about me. People who value me for who I am, not for who I can pretend to be. And I've been nurturing those friendships. Taking the time to connect with family again, going out with friends for weekends, laughing more, talking more. I've learned that I don't have to isolate myself anymore. I don't have to hide in my apartment or stay stuck in the past. I can just live, and it feels damn good. And, yeah, there's Sarah. I've mentioned her before, but I never really went into much detail. We've been dating for a while now, and I can honestly say I've never been in a relationship that feels this easy, right? She's not trying to fix me. She's not trying to heal me. She's just there. Supportive, kind, funny, and most importantly, real. No mind games. No pretending. It's been refreshing, honestly. I've learned how much I had sacrificed in my marriage with Emily, how much I had put aside for someone else's needs while my own were ignored. With Sarah, it's different. It's a partnership. We support each other, we have fun together, and we've found a rhythm that's just ours. And in the midst of all of this new life, this new sense of freedom, I can't help but feel incredibly grateful. Grateful for my friends who stuck by me when things were tough. Grateful for my family who reminded me that I wasn't alone, and even grateful for the lessons Emily taught me. Because as much as I hated those lessons at the time, as painful as they were to learn, they led me to this point. They led me to a version of myself that's stronger, smarter, and more aware of what I truly deserve. Gratitude. That's how I feel now. Grateful for everything that's happened, even the bad stuff, because it got me here. I'm not the guy I was when I first found out about the affair. I'm not the broken man who was drowning in confusion and pain. I'm someone who's been through hell, and come out the other side not just surviving, but thriving. I look at where I am now, at my job, my friendships, my relationship with Sarah, and I feel a peace that I never thought was possible after everything. I'm not just going through the motions anymore. I'm really living. And that's a gift I never thought I'd get back. So, yeah, I guess this is me saying I'm happy now. I'm genuinely happy. And that's something I'm incredibly grateful for. It might have taken a while to get here, but I've finally found the life I was always meant to live. And it's mine. No more second guessing. No more wondering if I made the right choices. I'm right where I'm supposed to be. And for the first time in a long time, that feels more than enough.